There is a law about money that almost nobody talks about anymore. It is over 3,000 years old. It involves the number 7. And once you understand it, you will never look at your bank account the same way again. This law shows up in some of the oldest legal codes in human history. Agricultural societies built entire economies around it. Religious and legal scholars across centuries wrote about it. And yet today, almost no one applies it because modern finance was built on the exact opposite idea. Here is the law in simple terms. Every 7th year, the land was given a rest. Every 7th year, debts that had become crushing were released. And built into the same rhythm was a third principle. Give first before you spend on anything else. 3 sevens. Rest, release, give. A complete financial operating system hiding inside what most people assume is just an old religious custom. Today, I am going to walk you through all 3, where they come from, why they worked, and how to apply a modern version of each one starting this week. Let me ask you something honest first. Have you ever looked at your bank account at the end of the month and wondered where it all went? You worked hard, you showed up every day, you gave up sleep, time with people you love, your own health, just to keep the numbers moving. And somehow they still don't add up. There's always more month left than money. Maybe you've tried budgeting apps. Maybe you've read the books. Maybe you've followed every piece of advice from every finance show you could find. And still something feels off, like there's a leak somewhere in your financial life that you cannot find no matter how hard you look. If that sounds familiar, here's something worth hearing. It is not because you're bad with money. It's because almost nobody teaches the actual rhythm money is supposed to move in. We're taught to grind constantly, borrow constantly, and keep everything we earn for ourselves. All 3 of those habits go directly against patterns that older economic and legal traditions understood instinctively. Patterns that, frankly, modern banking has very little interest in reminding you about, because modern banking runs on you doing the opposite. So let's get into where this actually comes from, because the history is more interesting than most people realize. The first 7 is about a rhythm of work and rest. It shows up clearly in the book of Exodus, where the instruction is to labor for 6 days and treat the 7th as a day of complete rest. Most people read that as a purely religious instruction about gathering for worship. But there's a practical, almost economic logic underneath it that's easy to miss. Think about what happens to a person or a business that never stops. When you work without pause, your judgment erodes long before your body gives out. You start saying yes to bad deals because you're exhausted. You spend money you don't have, trying to soothe the kind of burnout you can't even name. You stop noticing opportunities because your mind is too fogged with fatigue to see them clearly. There's a teaching preserved in the Talmud, in Tractate Beitzah, that a person's provision for the year is essentially fixed, except for what is spent honoring rest and sacred time, which is treated as outside that fixed allotment, almost as a separate account. Whether you take that literally or as a piece of ancient financial psychology, the practical insight holds up the resources you set aside to protect your capacity to think clearly are not really a loss. They're what makes everything else function. Picture 2 shopkeepers on the same street. One stays open every day, year-round, convinced that any day closed is money lost. The other closes 1 day a week, no exceptions, and uses that day to step back, look at the books, and think instead of just react. Over a few years, it's almost never the first shopkeeper who ends up ahead. Exhaustion is expensive. It just doesn't show up on a single day's receipts. It shows up later, compounding, in the bad decisions made while running on empty. That's the first 7. Work in cycles of 6 and 1. 6 days of focused, intentional effort. 1 day of real rest. not collapsing in front of a screen, but a deliberate pause where you review your finances, think about direction, and reconnect with what actually matters to you. If you are currently working 7 days a week with no exception, I want to be direct with you. You are not getting ahead. You're burning fuel without ever checking the map. Pick one day this week. It doesn't have to be a Saturday or a Sunday or tied to any tradition at all. Pick a day, stop working on it, and use it to look honestly at where your money is going. That single habit on its own has rescued more people from financial chaos than most investment strategies ever invented. But it's only the first piece. The second 7 is in some ways the most radical of the 3, and it is almost completely absent from how we think about money today. It's described in Deuteronomy chapter 15. At the end of every 7 years, debts were to be released. Loans that had become a burden were forgiven outright. The financial slate by law was wiped clean on a fixed cycle. It's worth sitting with how strange that sounds to modern ears, because the entire architecture of contemporary finance is built on the opposite assumption that debt should compound indefinitely, that minimum payments are simply a permanent fixture of adult life, that carrying balances for decades is just how things work. In the tradition this law comes from, debt was never meant to be a life sentence. It was meant to be cyclical, with a built-in pressure valve. Now, very few of us are in a position to legally cancel a mortgage every 7 years. But there's a practical version of this principle that almost nobody uses, and it costs nothing to apply. Imagine someone, we'll call him a composite of several people I've come across over the years, who built a real estate portfolio that looks successful from the outside. Properties, income, the appearance of security. Then the market turned, and what had looked like wealth turned out to be a stack of obligations he couldn't keep servicing. He stopped sleeping. He sat in his car outside his own office, unable to make himself go in. What eventually helped wasn't a new investment strategy. It was sitting down and treating his situation like a personal 7-year release, writing down every single financial commitment he had, every loan, every partnership, every recurring obligation, and asking one honest question about each. If I were starting today with a blank page, would I choose to take this on again? Everything that got a clear no, he began releasing. He sold properties at a loss rather than continuing to bleed money to hold them. He ended a business partnership that had quietly been draining far more than it returned. He canceled subscriptions and commitments he'd been paying out of pure habit. It took well over a year. His income actually dropped during that period, but his expenses dropped further. And for the first time in years, he was keeping more than he spent. A few years later, he'd rebuilt, this time without the dead weight. There's a related concept in the Talmud, in Tractate Gittin, describing a legal mechanism called the prosbul, developed specifically to let this release principle work practically within a functioning economy. Even within the original tradition, the point was never recklessness. It was intentional, periodic release of what no longer serves you. Here's your version of the second 7. Sometime this week, sit down and list every financial obligation you currently carry, every debt, every subscription, every recurring charge, everything quietly pulling money out of your account on autopilot. Then ask the same question. If I were starting fresh today, would I sign up for this again? Be honest. Be a little ruthless. The things you're holding on to out of habit, fear, or pride are very often the exact things standing between you and your next level of stability. There's a line in Pirkei Avot, the collection of ethical teachings, sometimes called ethics of the fathers, where the question is asked, who is rich? And the answer given is, the one who is satisfied with what they have. But you can't be satisfied with what you have if you don't actually know what you have. That's what this kind of periodic audit gives you, clarity. And clarity, more than any single investment, is the real foundation most lasting financial stability is built on. Now we get to the third 7, and this is the one that tends to surprise people most because it inverts the order almost everyone assumes is correct. It traces back to a moment in the book of Genesis. Jacob fleeing his brother with nothing, no home, no money, sleeping outdoors with a stone for a pillow, makes a vow that whatever he is given, he will set aside 1/10 of it. What's striking isn't the percentage. Tithing in some form shows up across many traditions. What's striking is the timing. He made this commitment at the exact moment he had nothing, not after he'd already become secure. In the agricultural cycle this law was embedded in, there was a specific tithe during the 7th year set aside not for ceremonial purposes, but explicitly for those in need, the poor, the widow, the stranger passing through. And in later mystical commentary, particularly in the Zohar, giving is described as opening a kind of channel, something that doesn't just flow outward, but creates a corresponding opening for things to flow back. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you only think of this as charity. The principle wasn't simply giving 10% of what you had left over. It was giving a portion first, before paying anything else. The underlying Hebrew word tzedakah, usually translated as charity, actually derives from a root meaning justice or righteousness, implying this isn't generosity in the sense of an optional kindness, but closer to a structural requirement of how resources are meant to circulate at all. Think of someone living on very little, a fixed, modest income, nothing to spare by most people's accounting, who nonetheless sets aside a small, consistent amount each month for someone else, not because she has extra, but as a deliberate practice regardless of how tight things get. People around her sometimes tell her she can't afford it. Her answer, more or less, is that she can't afford not to, that the discipline of giving first is itself what keeps her relationship to money clear-headed rather than anxious. Stories like this show up again and again in communities that have practiced this rhythm for generations. Not that giving magically multiplies money in some mystical sense, but that people who build the habit of giving before spending tend to develop a steadier, less scarcity-driven relationship with everything else they do financially. There's a well-known phrase in Tractate Ta'anit, built on a Hebrew wordplay between tithe and become wealthy, Aser bishvil shetitasher, roughly, tithe, so that you may become enriched. It's often treated as poetic, but it points to something practical. People who give in a structured, disciplined way tend to also budget, plan, and spend more deliberately overall. The giving and the financial discipline reinforce each other. Here's the practical version. Starting with your next paycheck, set aside a small, fixed percentage, even just a few percent to start, before you pay anything else, and direct it towards something that genuinely matters to you. A person in need, a cause, a community effort, not after the bills, before. I know that sounds backwards, maybe even a little frightening if money already feels tight, but notice the pattern in Jacob's story. The commitment came before the security, not after it. Now, let's bring all 3 together because this is where the actual power of the framework shows up. The first 7 says, rest on a fixed rhythm so your judgment stays sharp instead of frantic. The second 7 says, on a regular cycle, audit everything, release what no longer earns its place, and move forward without dragging debt obligations behind you. The third 7 says, give a portion first before anything else and let that discipline shape how you treat the rest of your money. Rest, release, give. It's not a coincidence that this mirrors a much older creative rhythm described in the same texts. 6 days of work, a 7th of rest, 6 years of cultivation, a 7th of release. Wealth, in this framework, isn't something to grip tightly and hoard. Money held with a closed fist tends to stagnate. Money managed deliberately, released periodically, and circulated generously tends to move in ways that simple hoarding never quite manages to replicate. There's a teaching in Pirkei Avot describing different attitudes toward possessions. One person who insists strictly on what's mine is mine, another who's willing to say what's mine is also yours. The second is described as the more admirable path, not through self-denial, but through a deeper understanding of how resources actually function when they're allowed to circulate. None of this is a guarantee or a magic formula. It's a discipline tested across a very long stretch of human history, for the simple reason that hoarding without rest and without circulation tends to produce burnout and brittleness, while rhythm, rest, release, give tends to produce something steadier and more durable over time. If any part of this resonated with you, here's what I'd ask. First, take 30 seconds and actually write down, somewhere you'll see it again, the words, "I choose the rhythm of 7." Putting it in writing tends to make a commitment feel real in a way that just thinking about it doesn't. Second, think of one person in your life who's working hard right now, but can't seem to get ahead. Send them this. Sometimes one idea, landing at the right moment, is enough to shift the direction of someone's entire year. The leak in your financial life that you've never quite been able to find. It's rarely a single bad decision. More often, it's the absence of rhythm, no rest to think clearly, no release of what's no longer working, no discipline of giving before spending. Build the rhythm back in, even imperfectly, and watch what starts to change.